I watched my sister Tara sneer at me across the backyard barbecue, her wine glass catching the afternoon sunlight. "So, what you just teach flight simulators now?" She laughed loud enough for everyone to hear. The entire family gathering went quiet. Uncle Brad stopped flipping burgers. Mom's smile froze. I felt that familiar knot in my stomach, the same one I'd carried since childhood, whenever Tara decided to remind everyone how she'd always been the successful one, while I remained the disappointment. The silence stretched across Mom's perfectly manicured backyard, like a storm cloud rolling in before a tornado. I could feel every pair of eyes in our family turning toward me, waiting for my response to Tara's latest verbal assault. This was nothing new. My sister had perfected the art of public humiliation over our 32 years of shared existence, and family gatherings had become her preferred stage for these performances. I sat there on the wooden deck chair, gripping my beer bottle just a little too tightly, and let my mind wander back to how we'd gotten to this point. Tara had always been the golden child. Straight A's from kindergarten through her MBA program at Northwestern. Valedictorian homecoming queen, full scholarship to university. Landed her dream job in marketing at a Fortune 500 company before she turned 25. Then she married Jake, this quiet, intense guy, who worked for the Navy in some capacity none of us quite understood. Perfect wedding, perfect house in the suburbs, perfect life trajectory that made our parents beam with pride every time someone asked about their children. And then there was me. Romeo Garcia, the family disappointment, who had somehow managed to stumble through life, making what everyone considered one bad decision after another. Dropped out of college twice, much to Dad's horror, before he passed away 3 years ago. Eventually joined the military, which Uncle Brad initially thought might straighten me out, until I left that career behind 2 years ago, to become what everyone saw as just another flight instructor at a small regional airport outside Denver. What they didn't know, what I couldn't tell them, was that those 8 years in the military hadn't been spent pushing papers or fixing helicopters. But my security clearance meant certain chapters of my life would forever remain classified, leaving my family to fill in the blanks with their own assumptions about my service record. The barbecue was supposed to celebrate Mom's 60th birthday. She'd gone all out hanging string lights between the oak trees, setting up folding tables with checkered tablecloths, even hiring a local band to play classic rock in the corner of the yard. Aunt Sarah had driven up from Colorado Springs with her twin boys Danny and Marcus, both successful lawyers, who never missed an opportunity to discuss their latest court victories. Cousin Beth brought her new fiancé, some investment banker, who spent most of the afternoon explaining cryptocurrency to anyone within earshot. But Tara had been circling me like a shark since I arrived, making little comments here and there about my career change, and how disappointed she was that I'd given up on my potential. She'd perfected this technique over the years. At Christmas, she'd mentioned how sad it was that I couldn't afford to buy nice presents for the family anymore. During Easter dinner, she'd loudly wondered whether I'd ever find a woman willing to settle for a guy with such limited ambition. At our cousin Maria's wedding last summer, she'd introduced me to strangers as my brother, who's still trying to figure out what he wants to be when he grows up. The pattern was always the same. She'd start small, just little digs disguised as sisterly concern. Then, when she had an audience, she'd escalate until I either exploded in anger, making myself look like the unstable family member, or I'd sit there and take it, confirming everyone's suspicion that I lacked the backbone to stand up for myself. Jake, her husband, typically stayed out of these confrontations. He'd position himself somewhere nearby, nursing a beer, watching everything with those sharp gray eyes that seemed to catalog details most people missed. He was built like the military guys I'd served with, compact and efficient with calloused hands, and the kind of alertness that never completely switched off. But he rarely spoke during family functions, letting Tara dominate conversations while he observed from the sidelines. Today felt different, though. Maybe it was the way the late afternoon sun cast everything in golden light, making the whole scene feel like some kind of reckoning. Maybe it was because I'd spent the morning at the airport, watching one of my students successfully complete his first solo cross-country flight, reminding me that my current work actually mattered to people. Or maybe I was just tired of carrying the weight of secrets that protected my family from understanding the real reasons behind my choices. Uncle Brad flipped another burger and glanced over at me with that expression I'd grown to hate. Disappointment, mixed with pity, the look of a Vietnam veteran who'd expected his nephew to show more fight than I seemed capable of mustering. He'd served 2 tours in Southeast Asia, came home with medals and stories he rarely shared, built a successful construction business from nothing. In his mind, military service was supposed to forge character, not create men who walked away from advancement opportunities to teach civilians how to read instrument panels. You know Romeo. Tara continued her voice, carrying that false sweetness she used when she wanted to sound concerned, instead of cruel. I just don't understand why you left the Air Force when you could have had a real career. Jake's always saying how the military takes care of people who stick with the program. She gestured toward her husband, who was suddenly very interested in peeling the label off his beer bottle. I mean, you could have been an officer by now. Maybe even a pilot yourself, instead of just teaching other people how to pretend to fly. The comment hit its intended mark. I felt heat creeping up my neck, that familiar combination of rage and helplessness that she'd been triggering since we were kids, fighting over toys in the living room. But this time, something inside me shifted. Maybe it was the way Jake's posture had changed when she mentioned flying, or the way his eyes had locked onto mine for just a split second before he looked away. For 8 years, I'd carried secrets that would have made my family proud if only I could have shared them. Classified missions that required security clearances most people couldn't even pronounce. Operations that happened in places that officially didn't exist, doing things that never made it into any newspaper or evening news broadcast. I'd made peace with their disappointment because I believed it was better than them living in fear. Better that they think I was a failure than know the truth about the enemies I'd made, the people who might consider my family legitimate targets if they understood my real service record. But sitting there, watching Tara perform for our relatives, while Jake studied me with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle, I realized I was tired of being the family embarrassment. Tired of protecting people who used that protection to hurt me. The internal struggle felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing that once I jumped, there would be no going back. For 2 years, I'd maintained the fiction that leaving the military had been a failure of nerve or ambition. I'd let them believe I was just another washout who couldn't handle the demands of real service. But Jake knew something. I could see it in the way he watched me, like he was waiting for me to reveal something important. And for the first time since I'd started this charade, I wondered what would happen if I did. Tara's opening salvo had apparently given the rest of the family permission to join in what was becoming a public referendum on my life choices. I watched in growing disbelief as the people who were supposed to love me most began piling on to what they perceived as my biggest weaknesses. Uncle Brad abandoned the grill entirely, walking over with his beer, and that familiar expression of paternal disappointment etched into the weathered lines around his eyes. Romeo, I got to say, son, I thought the military might put some steel in your spine. Your dad, God rest his soul, always worried you didn't have enough fight in you. Seems like maybe he was right. The words stung worse because they came from someone whose opinion had always mattered to me. Uncle Brad had been like a second father after Dad's heart attack, and his approval had meant everything during my teenage years. Hearing him express such open disappointment felt like being sucker punched by someone you trusted. Cousin Danny, who'd been content to discuss his latest corporate litigation victories with anyone who'd listen, suddenly found my situation far more interesting than his courtroom triumphs. He wandered over, straightening his polo shirt, and wearing that smug expression he'd perfected during law school. You know, Romeo, I never understood why you didn't leverage your military experience into something more substantial. I mean, veterans get preference for government jobs, federal contracting, all kinds of opportunities. But teaching flight simulators? He shook his head like he was genuinely puzzled. That's not even teaching real flying. That's basically running video games for adults who want to pretend they're pilots. Each comment felt like another shovel of dirt being thrown on my reputation. I glanced toward Mom, hoping she might intervene like she sometimes did when family discussions got too heated. But she was standing near the dessert table fidgeting with her necklace and avoiding eye contact. Her silence spoke louder than any words could have. She was embarrassed by me, ashamed of having to explain to her friends that her son had walked away from what they saw as a respectable career to become what amounted to a glorified video game instructor. Cousin Marcus, not to be outdone by his twin brother's professional superiority, decided to contribute his own perspective on my apparent failure to launch into proper adulthood. The thing is, Romeo, we're all getting to the age where we need to be serious about our futures. Building something that lasts. I mean, what's your retirement plan? What's your advancement path? Teaching simulator courses at some little airport doesn't exactly scream long-term security. Tara was practically glowing with satisfaction as she watched her relatives dissect my choices with surgical precision. She'd managed to turn what should have been a birthday celebration for our mother into a public intervention about my perceived shortcomings. This was exactly what she'd been building toward since I walked through the gate 2 hours earlier. And don't even get me started on your dating life. She continued, her voice taking on that false concern that made every word sound like a tiny knife being twisted. Remember Lisa, that sweet girl you dated for 2 years. Even she couldn't figure out what your long-term goals were. She told Mom she felt like she was dating someone who was just drifting through life without any real direction. The mention of Lisa hit harder than I expected. We'd broken up 18 months ago, and Tara was right that my inability to explain my real background had been part of the problem. How do you tell someone you care about that you can't discuss most of your military service because it's classified at levels that could land you in federal prison? How do you explain that your nightmares aren't from general combat stress, but from specific missions you're legally forbidden to acknowledge ever happened? Lisa had been patient for a while, but eventually my evasiveness about my past and my reasons for leaving the military had created a wall between us that neither of us knew how to cross. She'd started to believe I was either hiding something terrible or simply too immature to have a serious conversation about my own life history. Face it, Romeo, Tara said, raising her wine glass like she was making a toast to my failures. You're 32 years old, and you're teaching video games to wannabe pilots. You dropped out of college twice, you couldn't stick with the military when it got demanding, and now you're working at some tiny airport nobody's ever heard of, probably making less money than kids fresh out of college. The family had formed a semicircle around me now, like I was some kind of exhibit in a museum of disappointing life choices. I could feel their judgment pressing down on me from all sides, a suffocating weight of expectations I'd apparently failed to meet in every possible way. But something strange was happening with Jake. While everyone else was focused on cataloging my shortcomings, Tara's husband had gone very still. He was standing about 10 feet away, and I could see him watching the whole scene unfold with an expression I couldn't quite read. His posture had changed from the relaxed stance he'd maintained all afternoon to something more alert, more focused, like he was studying a situation that required careful analysis. Uncle Brad took another swig of his beer and delivered what felt like the killing blow. Son, your daddy fought in Desert Storm before he went into construction. Built something meaningful with his life. I did 2 tours in Vietnam, came home, and created a business that employed dozens of people over the years. That's what men do. They build something that lasts, something that matters. But you... He trailed off, shaking his head sadly. I just don't see the fight in you that we expected. Aunt Sarah, who'd been relatively quiet until now, decided to add her own perspective to the character assassination. Romeo, honey, we all love you, but we're worried about your future. You can't just drift through your 30s without any real plan. What happens when you want to get married, buy a house, start a family? How do you support those kinds of responsibilities on a flight instructor's salary? The worst part was that they genuinely believed they were helping me. Every cutting comment was delivered with the kind of loving concern that families use when they're trying to force someone to face what they see as obvious truths. They weren't being cruel for the sake of cruelty. They were being cruel because they thought I needed to wake up and start making better decisions. But I was carrying truths they couldn't understand, sacrifices they couldn't appreciate, and consequences they couldn't imagine. For 2 years, I'd let them believe I was a disappointment because the alternative was putting them in danger. I'd accepted their pity and their concern and their barely concealed shame because it kept them safe from enemies they didn't even know existed. Tara surveyed her handiwork with obvious satisfaction. She'd managed to turn our entire extended family into unwitting accomplices in her campaign to humiliate me. Every person whose opinion mattered to me had now openly expressed their disappointment in my choices, their concern about my future, and their belief that I was fundamentally lacking in the qualities that define successful men in our family. "The truth is," she said, raising her voice to make sure everyone could hear her final verdict, "Romeo has always been content with being mediocre. Even as kids, he never had the drive to really excel at anything. I think teaching simulator games is probably the perfect job for him because it doesn't require any real skill or responsibility." The humiliation was complete. I sat there surrounded by people who loved me, but couldn't respect me, who worried about me, but couldn't trust me to make good decisions, who wanted to help me, but couldn't see past their own assumptions about what my life meant. But Jake was still watching, and something in his expression told me that whatever was about to happen next would change everything. The pressure building in my chest felt like a steam engine reaching critical mass. Years of swallowing my pride, months of accepting their disappointment, and now this afternoon of systematic humiliation had finally pushed me past the breaking point where secrets mattered more than self-respect. I stood up, slowly setting my beer bottle on the deck railing with deliberate control. The conversations around me gradually faded as family members noticed the change in my demeanor. Something in my posture, maybe the way I'd straightened my shoulders, or the expression that had settled across my face, signaled that the dynamics of this gathering were about to shift dramatically. Tara, emboldened by the success of her public campaign against my character, decided to press her advantage. She had no way of knowing that she was about to cross a line that would reveal truths she wasn't prepared to handle. "Oh, what's this?" she said, her voice dripping with mock surprise. "Are you finally going to defend yourself? Going to tell us all about your big, important job, teaching people how to play pretend pilot?" She laughed, a sound sharp enough to cut glass. "What are you going to do, Romeo? Teach me how to fly a computer, how to—" The family was watching now with the kind of uncomfortable fascination people have when they sense a confrontation brewing, but can't look away. Mom had stopped rearranging the dessert table and was staring at us with growing alarm. Uncle Brad had crossed his arms over his chest, clearly expecting me to either explode in anger or retreat in humiliation, like I'd done so many times before. But something different was happening inside me. The rage I'd been carrying was transforming into something colder, more focused, something that reminded me of the mental state I'd learned to access during missions when clarity mattered more than emotion. "I don't teach simulators, Tara," I said, my voice level and calm in a way that seemed to surprise everyone, including myself. "I fly." Her laughter erupted, immediately loud and genuinely amused. "Oh, really, you fly? That's rich. What do you fly? Romeo crop dusters, traffic helicopters. Come on, enlighten us about your exciting aviation career." The family was clearly enjoying this new development. Finally, Romeo was going to defend himself, probably with some exaggerated story about his modest job that would make him look even more pathetic than before. They were settling in to watch me embarrass myself even further. But Jake had gone completely still. I could see him in my peripheral vision, and something about my tone or my posture had triggered a recognition that was making him study me with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle that suddenly seemed far more complex than he'd initially thought. "Sure, Romeo." Tara continued, her voice rising with amusement. "Tell us all about your flying career. What's your call sign? Don't all you military pilot types have those cute little nicknames?" The question hung in the air like a challenge that would either prove my credibility or destroy what little remained of my dignity. Call signs weren't something civilians typically understood. They weren't nicknames you gave yourself or chose from a list. They were earned through service assigned by fellow aviators, based on missions' personalities, or moments that defined your reputation within the community. I looked directly at her, feeling that familiar calm that came before making decisions that couldn't be undone. Night Warden. The effect was immediate and electric. Jake's beer bottle slipped from his fingers, hitting the deck with a sharp crack that sounded like a gunshot in the sudden silence. His face had gone pale, and he was staring at me with an expression that combined shock, disbelief, and something that looked almost like fear. Tara was still laughing, completely oblivious to her husband's reaction. Night Warden. Oh, that's precious. Did you make that up yourself? It sounds like something from a video game. But Jake was moving now, stepping forward with the kind of purposeful motion that meant everything had changed. His military bearing, which he typically kept hidden during family functions, was suddenly visible in every line of his body. He was no longer Tara's quiet husband who observed from the sidelines. He was someone else entirely. Tara, he said, his voice cutting through her laughter with an authority that made everyone in the backyard freeze. Stop talking. Now. She turned toward him with confusion and annoyance, clearly irritated that he was interrupting her moment of triumph. Jake, what are you doing? I'm just trying to get Romeo to be honest about his little hobby career. That call sign, Jake said, ignoring her completely and speaking directly to me. That's not a hobby career designation. I could see understanding beginning to dawn in his eyes, the pieces of a puzzle clicking into place in a way that was transforming his entire perception of who I was and what I'd done. His voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Night Warden was Special Operations Aviation. Deep reconnaissance, classified extraction missions. He paused, studying my face with growing certainty. Afghanistan, Syria, places that don't exist on any official mission reports. The backyard had gone completely silent. Even the hired band seemed to sense that something significant was happening and had stopped playing mid-song. Family members were looking back and forth between Jake and me with growing confusion, trying to understand why Tara's husband was speaking to me with what sounded like respect, possibly even reverence. Jake took another step closer, and I could see him processing information at high speed, connecting dots that civilians wouldn't even know existed. How many extractions? He asked quietly. Classified, I replied automatically. How many lives? I looked at him for a long moment, recognizing another warrior who would understand the weight that numbers could carry. Also classified. He nodded slowly, and I watched him make connections that were changing everything about how he saw me, how he understood my presence in his family, how he interpreted the last 2 years of watching me accept humiliation and disappointment without defending myself. Tara, he said again, his voice now carrying a command authority that brooked no argument. Apologize to your brother, right now. She stared at him in complete bewilderment, clearly struggling to understand how the conversation had gotten away from her so completely. Jake, what are you talking about? Romeo teaches flight simulators at some little airport. He knows exactly who I am, I said quietly, looking directly at Jake and seeing the recognition that was making everything else in the backyard fade into background noise. The balance of power had shifted so dramatically that everyone was struggling to catch up. Jake wasn't just defending me anymore. He was looking at me like I was someone whose reputation had preceded me, someone whose service record commanded automatic respect from people who understood what specialized aviation meant in the context of modern warfare. And in that moment, I realized that the secrets I'd been carrying to protect my family were about to become the truth that would finally set me free. Jake's transformation was like watching someone remove a carefully maintained disguise. The quiet, observant husband, who'd spent years blending into family gatherings, was replaced by someone whose bearing and intensity reminded me of the operators I'd worked with during classified missions. His eyes held the kind of focused intelligence that came from life or death decision-making under impossible circumstances. Everyone needs to understand something, Jake said, addressing the confused family members who were still trying to process what they'd just witnessed. Call signs aren't games. They're not nicknames you pick for yourself. They're designations that get assigned based on your service record, your specialization, and your reputation within the operational community. Uncle Brad, whose military experience was giving him the first glimpses of understanding, set down his beer and moved closer. Jake, what exactly are you saying? I'm saying that Night Warden isn't just any call sign. Jake replied, his voice carrying the weight of someone who was revealing information that had the potential to change everything. It's a designation that was associated with some of the most dangerous aviation missions of the last decade. He turned to face me directly, and I could see him making calculations, trying to piece together a timeline that would explain how someone with my apparent background had ended up at family barbecues being mocked for teaching civilian flight lessons. 3 years ago, Jake began, his voice taking on the measured tone of someone recounting events that had been burned into his memory. My SEAL team was conducting a classified operation in Afghanistan. The mission had gone completely sideways. We were 23 miles behind enemy lines, surrounded by hostile forces with no viable extraction route. The family was listening now with the kind of absolute attention that came from realizing they were hearing something important, something that might explain the tension that had suddenly transformed their casual gathering into something that felt far more serious. Our helicopter support had been compromised by anti-aircraft fire, Jake continued. Command was telling us to hold position and wait for dawn, but we had wounded team members and intelligence that suggested our location would be overrun within hours. We were looking at a complete loss of the mission and, potentially, the entire team. I could feel the familiar tightness in my chest that came whenever someone started recounting missions I'd been involved in. Even 3 years later, even in the safety of my mother's backyard, the memories carried a weight that made breathing difficult. Jake's voice grew quieter, more intense. Then we got word that someone was coming to get us. One pilot flying a modified aircraft that officially didn't exist, planning to extract a 6-man SEAL team from a hot landing zone in the middle of the night. Tara was staring at her husband with growing confusion. This wasn't the Jake she knew, the quiet man who worked some kind of undefined Navy job and rarely talked about his military service. This was someone else. Someone who was speaking with the authority of experience that she'd never suspected he possessed. The extraction zone was a clearing barely large enough for a helicopter, surrounded by cliffs on 3 sides, with confirmed enemy positions on the high ground, providing overlapping fields of fire, Jake said. Command had classified the mission as impossible. Too dangerous for standard extraction protocols. Too risky for conventional aviation support. He paused, looking at me with an expression that combined respect and something that might have been gratitude. But Night Warden came anyway. I could feel every eye in the backyard focused on me now. Family members who'd spent the afternoon cataloging my failures were beginning to understand that they might have been operating with incomplete information about my background and capabilities. The pilot made 4 separate passes through heavy ground fire, Jake continued. Each time he managed to extract 1 or 2 team members while taking damage that should have brought down the aircraft. On the final pass, with the bird smoking and alarms going off in the cockpit, he pulled out the last 2 members of my team, including my spotter, who'd taken shrapnel in the leg and couldn't move without assistance. Uncle Brad was leaning forward now, his veteran's instincts allowing him to understand the significance of what Jake was describing, even if the details were outside his experience. "How do you know all this?" he asked. Jake turned to look at him directly. "Because I was one of the men he saved." The silence that followed was complete. Even the background noise of the neighborhood seemed to have faded away, leaving only the sound of Jake's voice as he continued to reconstruct events that had taken place in places most civilians couldn't locate on a map. The mission debrief classified the extraction as one of the most dangerous aviation operations conducted that year, Jake said. The pilot had taken fire that should have been fatal, navigated terrain that was supposed to be impossible, and completed an extraction that Command had already written off as a complete loss. He was looking at me now with an intensity that made it clear he was remembering details that had been seared into his memory during what must have been one of the most terrifying nights of his life. 2 members of my team owed their lives to Night Warden's willingness to attempt something that every other pilot had refused to consider, Jake said. We never got to meet the pilot. Operational security meant we never learned his real name, never got to thank him personally for what he'd done. Tara was staring back and forth between her husband and me with an expression of growing disbelief. The conversation had moved so far beyond her understanding that she seemed to be struggling to process what she was hearing. Jake, she said weakly, what are you saying Romeo's not? Your brother saved my life, Jake said simply. He saved all our lives. And for 3 years, I've been sitting at family dinners listening to people talk about him like he was some kind of failure who couldn't handle real responsibility. The words hung in the air, like an indictment of everything that had been said that afternoon, everything that had been assumed about my character and my service, everything that had been used to justify the disappointment and concern that my family had been expressing for 2 years. Mom had moved closer during Jake's account, and I could see tears beginning to form in her eyes as she started to understand the magnitude of what she'd been hearing. Romeo, she whispered, is this true? I looked at the faces surrounding me, family members whose opinions had mattered to me my entire life, people whose respect I'd wanted but couldn't earn through truth, because the truth was classified at levels that could have endangered their safety. I can neither confirm nor deny the details of any classified operations, I said using the formal language that had become second nature during years of security briefings and debriefings. But Jake was nodding with understanding. That's exactly what someone with his clearance level would be required to say, he told the family. The fact that he can't talk about his service doesn't mean he didn't serve. It means he served in ways that require permanent security classifications. Uncle Brad was shaking his head slowly, and I could see him reassessing everything he thought he'd known about my military career. Son, he said quietly, why didn't you ever tell us? It was the question I'd been dreading and anticipating for 2 years, the one that would force me to explain decisions that had protected them from truths they weren't equipped to handle. Because some missions leave marks that follow you home, I said simply. And some enemies have long memories. The revelation was spreading through my family like ripples on a pond, each person processing the information at their own pace and reaching their own conclusions about what Jake's testimony meant for their understanding of who I was and what I'd done during my military service. Uncle Brad was the first to fully grasp the implications. His Vietnam experience had taught him about classified operations, about missions that never made it into official records, about the kinds of service that required permanent silence from the people who performed it. He walked over to where I was standing and looked me directly in the eyes. Romeo, he said quietly, I owe you an apology. Not just for today, but for the last 2 years of thinking you'd given up on something important, instead of giving up something for something more important. The distinction hit harder than I'd expected. For months, I'd been carrying the weight of their disappointment, accepting their belief that leaving the military had represented some kind of failure, of character, or ambition. But Uncle Brad understood what Jake was telling them. I hadn't left because I couldn't handle the demands of service. I'd left because I'd already given more than most people were ever asked to give. Jake was still standing near the center of the group, and I could see him making decisions about how much more information he could share without violating his own security obligations. The kind of specialized aviation that Romeo was involved in doesn't just require exceptional flying skills, he explained to the family. It requires psychological resilience that most people don't possess. The mission I described wasn't unusual for Night Warden. It was representative. Mom had moved close enough to reach out and touch my arm, her fingers shaking slightly as she tried to process the gap between the son she thought she'd raised and the man she was learning about. Romeo, honey, why couldn't you tell us any of this? It was a fair question that deserved an honest answer, even if I couldn't provide all the details that would have made the answer complete. Because the people I fought against don't distinguish between soldiers and their families, I said. Because letting you know what I'd done would have put you at risk from enemies who consider everyone connected to certain operations legitimate targets. The family was beginning to understand that my silence hadn't been about secrecy for its own sake. It had been about protection, about keeping them safe from consequences they didn't even know existed. Cousin Danny, who'd spent the afternoon lecturing me about career advancement and long-term planning, was looking at me with an expression that suggested he was reassessing everything he thought he'd known about success and failure. Romeo, I had no idea. When you left the military, we all assumed. You assumed what I needed you to assume, I said. It was safer that way. Jake was nodding with understanding. Operational security doesn't end when you leave the service, he explained to the family. Some classifications are permanent. Some missions create lifelong obligations to maintain silence about what happened and where it happened. Aunt Sarah had been listening with growing comprehension, and I could see her making connections between my behavior over the last 2 years and what she was learning about my actual background. Is that why you seemed so distant after you left the military? She asked. We thought you were just struggling to adjust to civilian life. The question touched on something I'd been dealing with in therapy for months, the challenge of transitioning from a world where life and death decisions were routine to one where the biggest crisis might be a canceled flight lesson or a maintenance issue with the training aircraft. Adjustment was part of it, I admitted. But the bigger challenge was learning how to live with secrets that I couldn't share with the people I cared about most. Jake's respect for my situation was evident in the way he was explaining the broader context to family members who were struggling to understand how someone could serve with distinction while appearing to have no accomplishments worth discussing. The military doesn't advertise its most sensitive operations, Jake told them. The people who conduct the most dangerous missions rarely get public recognition, because public recognition would compromise operational security. Night Warden's service record will probably remain classified for decades. Uncle Brad was shaking his head with what looked like a combination of admiration and regret. Son, I've been thinking you didn't have enough fight in you to stick with something demanding. But you had enough fight to stick with something so demanding that you can't even talk about it. The irony wasn't lost on me. For 2 years, I'd been seen as someone who'd walked away from challenge and responsibility, when the truth was that I'd walked away from challenge and responsibility because I'd already done more than my share of both. Cousin Marcus was looking at me with new interest, clearly trying to reconcile the family failure he'd been lecturing about career planning with someone whose service record commanded respect from a Navy SEAL. Romeo, what you're doing now teaching civilian pilots, is that related to your military experience? It was a question that allowed me to talk about something positive without violating security protocols. The skills are transferable, I said. Flight safety, emergency procedures, situational awareness. I'm helping civilian pilots learn techniques that could save their lives if they ever find themselves in dangerous situations. Jake was smiling now, and I could see him understanding the full scope of what I was doing with my current career. He's not just teaching people how to fly, Jake explained to the family. He's teaching them how to survive flying. That's not a step down from military service. That's applying military expertise to protect civilian lives. The shift in perspective was dramatic. Suddenly, my job at the regional airport wasn't seen as a retreat from meaningful work. It was seen as an application of specialized knowledge to a mission that mattered, even if it was less dramatic than what I'd done while in uniform. Mom was crying now, tears that seemed to combine relief with regret, and something that might have been pride. Romeo, I'm so sorry. We didn't understand what you'd been carrying. You weren't supposed to understand, I said gently. That was the point. But the truth was finally out, and I could feel a weight lifting from my shoulders that I'd been carrying for so long, I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand straight. For 2 years, I'd protected my family from knowing about my service, which had protected them from being proud of me. Now Jake's recognition had created space for them to understand that my choices had been about their safety, not my limitations. The conversation was transforming from one about my failures to one about my sacrifices, and I could see family members beginning to reassess not just my military service, but my current choices, my apparent lack of ambition, my willingness to accept their disappointment without defending myself. Everything was beginning to make sense to them now, and for the first time in 2 years, I was beginning to feel like I could be myself around the people I loved most. While the rest of the family was processing the revelations about my military service with growing understanding and regret, Tara remained silent in a way that was unlike anything I'd ever seen from her. My sister, who'd built her identity around being the successful family member who could confidently judge everyone else's choices, was confronting information that was systematically destroying her worldview. She was standing apart from the group, now holding her wine glass, like it was the only solid thing in a world that had suddenly become unstable. I could see her mind working frantically, trying to reconcile the brother she'd been mocking for years with the man Jake was describing with obvious respect and admiration. Jake noticed her isolation and moved toward her with the kind of careful attention he might give to a teammate who was struggling to process traumatic information. "Tara," he said gently, "do you understand what we've been talking about?" She looked at him with eyes that seemed larger than usual confusion, and something that might have been fear, making her appear younger and more vulnerable than I'd seen her since we were children. "Jake, I don't understand any of this. Romeo teaches flight simulators. He's exactly what I described," Jake said firmly. "Your brother is someone whose military service was classified at levels that required him to let his own family believe he was a failure, rather than risk exposing them to the enemies he'd made during his missions." The words hit Tara like physical blows. I could see her processing the implications, understanding that every mockery, every public humiliation, every expression of disappointment she'd directed at me over the last 2 years had been targeting someone who'd been protecting her from truths she couldn't handle. "But he never said anything," she whispered. "He never defended himself. He just sat there and took it whenever I—" She trailed off, apparently realizing that completing the sentence would require her to confront the full scope of her own behavior. "He took it because defending himself would have required revealing classified information that could have put you and everyone else in this family at risk," Jake explained. "He chose to protect you rather than protect his own reputation." The silence that followed was heavy with implications that Tara was clearly struggling to process. She'd built years of family interactions around the assumption that she was the successful sibling offering guidance to a brother who'd failed to reach his potential. Now she was discovering that her guidance had been uninformed criticism directed at someone who'd already sacrificed more than she could imagine. Uncle Brad, who was still processing his own misconceptions about my service, looked at Tara with an expression that combined understanding with gentle disapproval. "Tara, honey, maybe it's time to think about how we've all been treating Romeo without knowing what he'd given up for our safety." But Tara's reckoning was deeper than just acknowledging that she'd been wrong about my military service. She was confronting the reality that her entire self-image had been built on a foundation of false assumptions. For years, she'd seen herself as the family member who'd made smart choices and achieved meaningful success, while Romeo had drifted through life without direction or purpose. "I don't understand," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "If you did all these things, if you're some kind of hero, why didn't you ever tell us? Why did you let us think?" "Because heroes don't need recognition from their families," I said quietly. "They need their families to be safe." The simple statement seemed to break something inside her. She set down her wineglass with shaking hands and covered her face with her palms, shoulders shaking with what looked like the beginning of a complete emotional breakdown. Jake moved closer to his wife, his expression showing concern for her psychological state, as she processed information that was challenging everything she thought she knew about her relationship with me and her place in the family hierarchy. "Tara," He said gently, "This doesn't change who you are or what you've accomplished. It just means you were operating with incomplete information about your brother." But I could see that wasn't true for her. Tara's identity had been so tied to being the successful sibling that discovering my actual background was forcing her to confront uncomfortable truths about her own motivations and behavior. She'd spent years using my apparent failures to validate her own achievements, and now she was learning that her validation had been based on a fiction I'd maintained to protect her. "Romeo," she said through her fingers, "I'm so sorry. I had no idea. I thought you were just—" She stopped, apparently realizing that explaining what she'd thought would require her to acknowledge how cruel she'd been to someone who deserved her respect and gratitude. "You thought what I needed you to think?" I said, echoing what I'd told the rest of the family. That was the only way to keep everyone safe. But Tara was shaking her head clearly, struggling with implications that went beyond just misunderstanding my military service. "I was awful to you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For years, I was awful to you. And you were—" "I was doing what I thought was best for the people I loved," I said simply. Jake was watching his wife with growing concern as she confronted the full scope of her behavior toward someone she was now learning had been protecting her all along. "Tara, you couldn't have known," he said. "Romeo made sure you couldn't know." "But I should have trusted him," she replied, tears beginning to flow freely now. "He's my brother. I should have trusted that he had good reasons for his choices, instead of assuming he was just weak, or lazy, or unmotivated." The breakdown I was watching wasn't just about guilt over specific comments or incidents. It was about a fundamental reassessment of her own character, her own capacity for empathy, and understanding her own willingness to judge people without having all the information necessary to make those judgments fairly. Mom had moved closer during Tara's emotional crisis, and I could see her trying to figure out how to comfort a daughter who was confronting uncomfortable truths about her own behavior toward her brother. "Tara, honey," Mom said softly, "we all made mistakes. We all misunderstood what Romeo's choices meant. But now we know better, and we can do better." But Tara was looking at me with an expression that suggested she was seeing me clearly for the first time in years, understanding not just what I'd done, but what I'd endured from my own family while doing it. "Romeo," she said, "how can you even stand to look at me? How can you forgive me for being so horrible when you were protecting all of us?" It was a question that cut to the heart of everything I'd been struggling with for 2 years. The truth was that her behavior had hurt deeply and consistently. But the other truth was that hurting her back wouldn't accomplish anything positive for either of us. "Because you're my sister," I said simply. "And because forgiveness isn't something you earn. It's something you choose to give." The words seemed to affect her even more powerfully than Jake's revelations about my military service. She was looking at me now, like she was seeing not just a brother she'd misunderstood, but a person whose character was fundamentally different from what she'd assumed. And in that moment, I realized that the truth wasn't just setting me free. It was giving all of us the opportunity to build something better than what we'd had before. 6 months later, I was standing in almost the same spot in Mom's backyard, but everything else had changed in ways that would have been impossible to imagine during that afternoon, when my world had been turned upside down by a single question about call signs. The occasion was Mom's birthday again, but this time, the gathering felt completely different. Instead of the undercurrent of disappointment and concern that had characterized family functions for 2 years, there was a sense of genuine connection and mutual respect that made conversations feel natural instead of strained. Tara was helping Mom arrange flowers on the picnic tables, and I could see the careful attention she was paying to details that might make the afternoon more enjoyable for everyone present. Her transformation over the last 6 months had been remarkable to witness. The entitled, judgmental sister, who'd used family gatherings to showcase her superiority, had been replaced by someone who seemed genuinely interested in other people's experiences and perspectives. "Romeo," she called over to me. "Can you help me move this table closer to the shade? I want to make sure Uncle Brad doesn't get too much sun on his back." It was a small gesture, but it represented a fundamental change in how she approached family relationships. Instead of looking for opportunities to demonstrate her own success, she was looking for ways to contribute to other people's comfort and happiness. The shift hadn't happened overnight, but it had been consistent and genuine. Jake was tending the grill with Uncle Brad, and I could hear them discussing different techniques for smoking brisket. My brother-in-law's presence at family gatherings had evolved from quietly observant to actively engaged. Our shared understanding of military service had created a friendship that extended beyond just respecting each other's backgrounds. "So, Romeo," Uncle Brad was saying as I walked over to join them, "Jake tells me you've got some new students who are really taking to the advanced emergency procedures training." It was true. My work at the airport had expanded significantly over the last few months. Word had somehow gotten around the civilian aviation community that the flight instructor at Denver Regional had experience with techniques that weren't typically taught in standard training programs. I was getting referrals from pilots who wanted to learn skills that could save their lives in situations that regular flight schools didn't prepare people to handle. "Yeah," I said, accepting a beer from Jake. "Had a corporate pilot last week who wanted to learn high-altitude navigation procedures that might help if his GPS system failed over mountainous terrain. Another guy who does medical transport flights asked about emergency landing techniques for situations when your primary landing site becomes unavailable." Jake was smiling with understanding. "You're not just teaching people how to fly," he said. "You're teaching them how to survive flying." The distinction mattered to me more than I'd expected. For months after leaving the military, I'd struggled with feeling like my expertise wasn't being used for anything meaningful. Teaching basic flight patterns to weekend pilots had felt like a waste of skills that had been developed for far more demanding situations. But as my reputation had grown, and my student base had evolved to include pilots who needed specialized training, I'd begun to understand that my current work was actually a natural extension of my military service. Instead of using my skills to extract soldiers from dangerous situations, I was using them to keep civilian pilots from ending up in dangerous situations in the first place. "The best part," I continued, "is seeing people develop confidence in their own capabilities. Yesterday, I had a student successfully navigate a simulated emergency that would have been catastrophic 6 months ago. That's the kind of thing that makes the work feel worthwhile." Uncle Brad was nodding with approval. "That's what good teaching does," he said. "It doesn't just transfer knowledge. It builds people up so they can handle challenges they didn't think they could handle." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Aunt Sarah and her twins Danny and Marcus, who'd driven up from Colorado Springs for the celebration. But instead of the competitive professional discussions that had characterized their previous visits, they seemed genuinely interested in catching up with everyone's lives. "Romeo," Danny said, as he walked over to join our group, "I heard you've been getting some recognition for your flight training programs. Jake mentioned that some of your students have been recommending you to other pilots." It was true, though. I hadn't expected the recognition to spread as widely as it had. Several of my students had written testimonials about their training experiences that had been published in aviation magazines. One pilot credited the emergency procedures I'd taught him with saving his life during an actual in-flight emergency over the Rocky Mountains. "Word of mouth has been good," I admitted. "Turns out there's a real need for the kind of advanced training that most civilian programs don't provide." Marcus was listening with interest, rather than the competitive analysis that had characterized our previous interactions. "Have you thought about expanding the program? Maybe developing a curriculum that could be taught at other airports?" It was actually something I'd been considering. Several other flight schools had reached out about licensing my training methods, and I'd been working with a curriculum development specialist to create materials that could be used by instructors who didn't have my specific background. "I'm exploring some options," I said. "There's potential to reach a lot more pilots than I can train individually." The conversation was flowing naturally, without the undercurrents of judgment and comparison that had made previous family gatherings feel like performance evaluations. People were asking questions because they were genuinely interested in the answers, not because they were looking for evidence of success or failure to support predetermined conclusions. Mom joined our group carrying a plate of appetizers she'd spent the morning preparing. "Romeo, honey, I'm so proud of how you've built something meaningful from your experiences," she said. "Your father would have been proud too." The mention of Dad hit me with unexpected emotion. For years, I'd carried regret about his death occurring during a period when he was disappointed in my apparent lack of direction. He died without knowing that I was actually serving with distinction in roles that mattered but couldn't be discussed. "I think Dad would have understood," I said quietly. "He knew about making sacrifices for family, even when family couldn't understand what you were sacrificing." Mom's eyes filled with tears, but they were different from the tears she'd shed 6 months earlier when she'd learned about my military service. These were tears of gratitude, rather than regret, understanding, rather than confusion. Tara had finished with the flower arrangements and was walking toward our group with an expression that suggested she had something specific she wanted to say. Over the last few months, she'd developed a habit of using family gatherings to express appreciation for things that had previously gone unacknowledged. "Romeo," she said, "I wanted to tell you that Jake and I have been volunteering with an organization that provides support services to veterans who are transitioning to civilian careers. Some of the people we work with are dealing with situations similar to what you went through." I was surprised, but pleased. Tara's marketing skills had turned out to be valuable for organizations that needed help communicating their missions to potential supporters and volunteers. But more importantly, her work with veterans had given her a deeper understanding of the challenges that service members face when they return to civilian life. "How's that going?" I asked. "It's been eye-opening," she admitted. "I've learned a lot about how many veterans struggle with the gap between what they've accomplished in the military and what they're able to talk about with their families and employers. Your situation wasn't unique." Jake was nodding with understanding. "The confidentiality requirements create real barriers to getting recognition for service that genuinely deserves recognition," he said. "Tara's been helping develop communication strategies that allow veterans to describe their capabilities without violating security protocols." It was meaningful work that was clearly giving Tara a sense of purpose that went beyond her corporate marketing career. More importantly for our relationship, it was work that had helped her understand the broader context of what I'd experienced during my transition from military to civilian life. "The organization is always looking for volunteers who have experience with specialized training," Tara continued. "If you're ever interested in getting involved, I think your perspective would be valuable." It was an invitation, rather than a suggestion offered without any implication that I should change my current focus or that my work at the airport was insufficient. The respect for my choices that Tara had developed over the last few months had become one of the most significant changes in our family dynamics. "I'll think about it," I said. "Right now, I'm pretty committed to building the training program, but there might be opportunities for collaboration down the road." The afternoon continued with the kind of relaxed conversation that had been missing from family gatherings for years. People were sharing updates about their lives, asking questions about each other's work, and offering support without the competitive undertones that had made previous interactions feel exhausting. As the sun was beginning to set, and family members were starting to think about heading home, Jake pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Romeo," he said, "I want you to know that learning about your background has changed how I think about a lot of things. Not just military service, but about the importance of supporting people, even when you don't understand their choices." It was a thoughtful observation that went beyond just our specific situation. "What do you mean?" I asked. "I mean that for years, I watched you accept criticism and disappointment from people who loved you, and I assumed that you were just someone who didn't know how to stand up for yourself. But you were actually someone who was strong enough to protect other people by absorbing their disappointment, instead of defending yourself with information they couldn't safely know." He paused, looking across the backyard at Tara, who was helping Mom pack up leftovers for family members to take home. That takes a kind of strength that's different from what most people think of as courage, Jake continued. It's the courage to let people think less of you than you deserve, because protecting them is more important than protecting your reputation. His words captured something I'd been struggling to articulate about my own choices. For 2 years, I'd questioned whether accepting my family's disappointment had been the right decision. Listening to Jake describe it as a form of courage, rather than weakness, helped me understand that my choices had reflected my values, rather than my limitations. As family members began saying their goodbyes and making plans for future gatherings, I found myself feeling grateful for the journey that had brought us to this point. The truth had been painful to reveal, and painful for my family to process, but it had created space for relationships based on understanding rather than assumptions. Tara was the last to leave, and she stopped to give me a hug that felt genuine rather than obligatory. Romeo. She said, "I know I've said this before, but I want to say it again. I'm sorry for not trusting that you had good reasons for your choices, and I'm grateful that you protected all of us, even when protecting us meant accepting unfair treatment from people who should have supported you." "Thank you," I said simply. "That means a lot." "I love you," she said. "Not in spite of what you've done, but because of who you are. And I promise I'll never again assume I understand someone's situation without taking time to really listen to their perspective." As I watched her walk to her car with Jake, I realized that the most important lesson from everything we'd been through wasn't about military service, or family loyalty, or even forgiveness. It was about the importance of recognizing that every person carries stories we don't know, struggles we can't see, and sacrifices we might not understand. The people we love most are often carrying burdens we can't imagine, making choices we wouldn't make, and protecting us in ways we might not recognize. The least we can do is offer them the benefit of the doubt and the gift of our trust, even when their decisions don't make sense from our limited perspective. Standing there in Mom's backyard as the last cars pulled away and the string lights cast gentle shadows across the empty picnic tables, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not just with my family, but with my own choices, my own story, and my own future. The secrets I'd carried to protect the people I loved had finally become the truth that set all of us free. And the brother, who'd been seen as the family disappointment, had become someone whose choices were understood as expressions of love, rather than limitations of character. Sometimes, the greatest victories aren't about fighting back against people who hurt us. Sometimes, they're about finding the courage to forgive people who hurt us without understanding what they were doing, and then building something better together than what any of us could have created alone. I'd spent 2 years protecting my family from the truth about my service. But the real gift hadn't been my protection. It had been their willingness to grow, to change, to acknowledge their mistakes, and to build relationships based on understanding rather than assumptions. That was worth more than any recognition, any medal, or any call sign could ever be. So, let me ask you this. Have you ever misjudged someone based on what you could see, instead of what you couldn't know? Have you ever discovered that someone you thought was weak was actually carrying burdens that required incredible strength? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if this story moved, you please hit that like button and subscribe for more content about family forgiveness and the hidden heroism that surrounds us every day. Don't forget to share this with someone who might need to hear that their quiet strength matters, even when the world doesn't recognize it. Thank you for listening to this story, and remember that the people who love us most are often protecting us in ways we might never fully understand. May we all have the wisdom to offer trust instead of judgment, and the courage to believe that there's always more to every story than what meets the eye.